Welcome back to another edition of Cal's Corner Radio here on the X Zone Broadcast Network, or xzbn.net. My name is Kal Korff, and I'm your host. Again, the show is Cal's Corner. And we cover on this show everything from politics to the paranormal, which is a lot of subjects. And the executive producer of the show, once again, is the one and only Rob McConnell. Now, folks, let's take a break from UFOs for at least this episode. What I'd like to talk about is something much more down to earth. It's something that, as a investigative journalist and longtime reporter, especially covering the scene in Asia for the past 7 years, that I've written a lot on what I always call communist China. And the reason I always say communist China is because they are communist, okay? If they were democratic, I'd call them democratic China or just China, but they're not. They're communist. And we'll get back to that in a moment. But the reason I want to talk to you about that today is because there is a war going on right now, whether people want to admit it or not, between the United States and China. Now, I've said China instead of communist China. Again, a war is taking place now between the United States and communist China. Now, the reason it's taking place, it doesn't involve bullets. It doesn't involve large armies, although it can at some point in the future. And if things don't change, it will. I promise you. The reason there is a war going on and what it involves has to do with economies, has to do with money. And in today's world, where you have weapons of mass destruction, where the use of them just isn't practical, economy and money is the new bullet currency, if you will, for modern era wars. Countries will fight each other economically instead of sending soldiers because they think it's a smarter way to do it, and it is a smarter way to do it depending on the circumstances. Let's say World War II was happening right now. You couldn't choke off Hitler and the Nazis economically. You had to use soldiers. But what's going on today is that American President Donald Trump, he ran on the platform, and most Americans agree with him, that the trade deficit with China has been out of control for too long, and that especially the Democratic National Party and its politicians, led by the Clintons, and we'll prove that in a moment, have created this massive transfer of wealth to Asia, trying to force globalization on everybody. This so-called New World Order of a globalized society, often at the expense of individualism, cultures, what makes different countries unique in their fine traditions. It's a recipe for disaster. It is failing in just enough areas that what it has caused, the failure to implement globalization properly, is it has caused extreme polarization in this world. And we can see that all over the political map in Europe as well as the United States. The fact that Donald Trump is sitting in the White House now instead of Hillary Clinton, who's a globalist elitist, her and her husband, is proof that there's a blowback against this type of mentality. So the two largest company or economies in the world, by far, they're now officially at war. But again, instead of missiles flying, trade tariffs and other forms of economic weaponry are now being used. Don't be fooled, folks. Communist China is also preparing for a military conflict, I promise you, with the United States. Should China win, let's be blunt, the rest of the world loses. So the time to rise up against China is now, not in the future when it'll be too late. Or you better prepare yourself for defeat. Now, you might say, what is he talking about? What is Cal? Has he lost his mind? No, I'm going to back this up with facts. Now, I have always been consistent in my reporting on the grim reality of how communist China is in fact the greatest threat to global peace and stability in the world today. Put another way, the world's greatest threat, we're talking geopolitically, socially, economically, militarily, ideologically, religiously, etc., is not the scourge of terrorism, contrary to what most people think. Instead, it is a single nation, communist China. Now, if you think that my view is harsh or it's a neoconservative view, it's right-wing, in the views of the left-wing liberals, because I've heard them say this before. They advocate globalism, these self-proclaimed progressives and the Democrats. Well, the facts that I'm going to share with you cannot be denied. That doesn't mean people are not in denial of them, but I can back them up with chapter and verse. In fact, as a longtime analyst reporting on China, let's easily unmask and destroy any doubts about the threat that China poses to the future of the human race if its present actions are not stopped. In other words, it's not the future is not etched in stone, thankfully. China can be stopped now if enough of the world rises up and acts against it economically now. Unfortunately, it's not doing it. So, to understand how and why today's crisis with China has reached the point that it has today, with a trade war now escalating, having started between the United States and Communist China, we need to briefly review what major prior events took place. Now, the short version is this. During the Cold War decades, now this would be against the former Russian-created Communist Soviet Union, formerly known as the USSR, American President Richard Nixon worked with his then Secretary of State, Dr. Henry Kissinger, to make a point to not only start détente and begin sincere nuclear arms reductions talks with the Russians, but to use as leverage against them, to give them some incentive, for lack of a better term. Nixon also courted the Communist Chinese. Now, when Nixon made his historic trip to China to meet its then communist revolutionary leader, Chairman Mao, a man who holds history's most infamous record for being the greatest mass murderer in history. You can look it up. Mao is responsible for having killed as many as 100 million people. Experts are not sure of the exact number because nobody cared enough to count the bodies. None of this mattered to Nixon. Nixon's thinking instead was that if China could be engaged properly, that was a key phrase here, that it could be a rival to be pitted against Russia, and that if the economy of China was increasingly integrated with the economics of the West, led by the West, because the West was much more industrialized than China was at that time, and China still is today behind the West in industrialization, Nixon felt that the likely result would be a decrease in the chances of war ever taking place between the U.S. and China, since China would have much to lose and would never destroy its own interests. Nice theory, but hasn't quite worked that way. So while one can argue that it was Nixon and Kissinger who first paved the way for what later ended up being trillions of dollars of outsourcing to China by Western companies, creating a massive shift of wealth redistribution from the West to Asia, it wasn't Nixon, but instead Democrat Bill Clinton many years later, who set the USA and the Western world on course, ensuring an inevitable conflict against China, which has now begun economically. Now, Bill Clinton, like his vice president, Al Gore, they're global elitists. They not only believe in globalism, Clinton's policies and actions ensured that conflict with China, again, would be inevitable one day. Acting unilaterally, there's that magic word the Democrats hate when a Republican does it or when Trump does it, but they don't mind when Obama or they do it. Clinton signed on his own a presidential executive order dropping just enough restrictions on China so that it was then free to start its grand plans to conquer the world, which the Chinese started to do. To believe for 1 minute that Chinese leaders didn't understand what they were now allowed to get away with would be incredibly stupid. So prior to Clinton signing his executive order, China was being held back economically from global economic integration because of its terrible human rights record, its unfair trading practices, its stealing of intellectual property, and the brutality of its dictatorship, etc. Now, suddenly, none of this mattered. Clinton dropped all these conditions, and he championed China's entrance into the World Trade Organization. These are the breaks that China needed, human rights and spreading democracy in the country. The Clintons no longer cared about it. The Democrats no longer cared. Yes, the Democrats, folks, get over it. So at the UN level, United Nations, China also had its rubber stamp backers who were in power, controlling and corrupting things at that time when the Clintons and Al Gore were busy doing their dirty business. Maurice Strong, one example, was the UN's corrupt Undersecretary General. He not only had real estate holdings in China, he was a Marxist sympathizer. His cousin knew and has photographed with Chairman Mao. Strong worked with individuals like Al Gore. Al Gore to this day still lauds Strong to further the shift of economic might to Asia. Strong and Gore also worked on the issue of what is euphemistically called global warming, now today called climate change, which was then additionally used as a means to pump more money into China in exchange for Chinese promises to clean up the environment, many of which they haven't kept. Now, fast forward now to the present, decades later. China is the world's second largest economy. It has the world's largest population. It now imports half of all the world's vital resources, is America's largest trading partner, but by Chinese one-sided terms. Again, the trade deficit the U.S. has with China stands at around some $500 billion. Now, Trump has an issue with this. In fact, any American would, and especially a president. For Trump not to care would be wrong. So what has China been largely doing with its mega wealth since Clinton and his executive order essentially opened the floodgates? Well, after this commercial break, we'll start discussing the brutal answer, and while the world, and prove that the world is ignoring this answer at its own peril.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
You have heard of the X-Zone? Now watch it on Simul TV. Plus 500 video games, live TV channels, free video on demand, worldwide, and more. Does this sound like tomorrow's television? Well, it is, but you can have it today, right now. It is Simul TV. Simul TV offers what the others only wish they could provide. 15 exclusive channels like X-Zone, sci-fi, and horror. We are worldwide. No other provider offers that. 500 built-in video games. No need to have an extra expensive system. We have them included. Free video on demand. Live streaming events from around the world. Interactive online network, and much more. Tomorrow's TV today. Simul TV. Sound too good to be true? Well, it's not. You can have Simul TV today. Sign up at simultv.com. Do it today.
We live in rapidly shifting times of extreme volatility and uncertainty. Such profound change brings a unique opportunity for the evolution of consciousness. I'm Gwilda Wiyaka, host of Mission Evolution Radio Show, a program that explores the latest scientific developments and deepening spiritual truths supporting human evolution. Join me on xzbn.net, where I interview leading experts in science, physics, medicine, spirituality, and more. By applying divergent viewpoints to leading-edge topics, we uncover expansive and evolutionary truth to assist you on your path to enlightenment. More information and past episodes are available at missionevolution.org.
Welcome back to segment 2 here on Cal's Corner radio show. My name is Kal Korff, and I'm your host, and the executive producer of this show is Rob McConnell. Now, we're giving a little bit of background, if you will, history, brief recap of what had happened over the last decades regarding communist China and its rise to becoming a world economic superpower. Let's give it its credit where credit is due. China is an economic superpower. The United States is the world's only overall superpower. It has, of course, a stronger economy, but China is number 2, and it is poised to overtake the United States in the near future. So let's continue, and let's pick up where we left off, which is to now explain what China has been doing with its trillions of dollars over the last decades. Now, this is what I call China's Holy Trinity. Now, everything today's communist China is busy doing and deliberately not doing, that's a key caveat here, folks, is subservient to 3 major programs that China is imposing on the world. One is called the 2020 Plan. The second is called Made in China 2025. And the third one is called the 2050 Plan. Now, as I have frequently reported over the years as an investigative journalist in India, China's 2020 Plan calls for the conquest of the island nation of Taiwan. Now, the world knows about this operation. Its existence was exposed when actual classified documents from the Chinese government were leaked to the media years ago. Yet how many people worry over this issue today? The answer, shamefully, is not enough. Unless you live in Taiwan, do you think people in Germany are worrying over this issue? No. Do you think people in England care? No. They might start caring after China attacks Taiwan. But do they care now? Are they doing anything to stop it? Do they worry about it? Do they talk about it on the news? Do they even bother raising awareness of this issue? The answer is absolutely not, and it's inexcusable. Now, according to China's official 2020 plan, again, we know about it because the military documents were leaked years ago. At least 16 different locations on the island nation of Taiwan will be invaded by Communist China in what they are planning to be a rapidly paced, massive naval assault, an amphibious assault, if you will, supported by firing 1,000 missiles against Taiwan to first soften up its defenses and destroy facilities, and then China plans to use its Air Force and Navy combined with submarines to set up what one might call a no-go zone to bide time so that American, Japanese, and other forces can't respond fast enough. Now, should they try, China's construction of new artificial islands and its now having militarized them gives it additional firepower in that region that it didn't have before. And China is not only making artificial islands and militarizing them, it is even it is even making claims to disputed territory. China has taken its bogus argument to the United Nations, and the United Nations has told China, you're wrong, get over it, but China refuses to comply with the United Nations' wishes. So what has happened is that any military conflict with China would necessitate that the United States and its allies destroy these new military bases that China has set up. In fact, it might be that one reason China has set them up is so that they can be attacked and destroyed without causing major losses to mainland China. Who knows? You'd have to ask the Chinese generals who have planned this invasion. And yes, they are serious. So to be clear, while China would rather take Taiwan peacefully, if they can, if it's possible, China is not bluffing when it says it will use military force if necessary to achieve this goal. Now, thanks to the trillions of dollars that China has made over decades by becoming an economic powerhouse, thanks to outsourcing to it from the West, China has been using this infusion of wealth to upgrade its military and everything that is necessary to achieve the holy trinity that they are planning. Now, assuming that China delays invading Taiwan in 2020 and puts it off for, say, a few more years, its Made in China 2025 program is of even more concern to American officials and others who genuinely understand the true nature of Communist China. In other words, it's bad enough that China wants to invade Taiwan and conquer it and reabsorb it into China. That's terrible. The world should not stand by and let that happen. But it is even worse, if you can imagine that China has a plan called the 2025 plan. And let me tell you and prove why this is one of the greatest threats to the rest of the world today. China has a plan to corner the market or control the market on all vital elements and resources by the year 2025, and also become a manufacturing powerhouse so that it becomes self-sufficient. In other words, China today lags behind even South Korea in making things such as microprocessors. Compared to what Samsung can do, for example, China can't do anything. They're a joke. Okay. One of the reasons the United States won the Cold War against Russia is Russia couldn't make a decent microprocessor for many, many years. So what did the Russians have to do during the Cold War? They actually had to smuggle in Western computers, pull off the microchips, and try to reprogram things so that they could make their own computer from stolen or imported black market parts. They couldn't make their own parts. So China wants to go ahead and by 2025 have the ability to be self-sufficient, to have cornered or monopolized or controlled all the world's vital resources, or at least minerals. In Afghanistan, for example, they have bought 80% of all the mineral rights. Well, guess what they're doing now? They are shipping huge quantities of raw material all the way to Beijing. They have built massive highways from Afghanistan all the way into China. They're doing the same thing with Pakistan. They've even bought a port and have renovated it. And they're doing this around the world. So what China has done is they've diversified their supply chain so that if there is ever a war, they're not going to be hung out to dry. They have cornered the market on some rare earth metals, which if China wanted to, they could go ahead and really stick it to the West and really hurt them economically, but China's not ready to do that yet. Instead, what China is doing is biding its time so that by the year 2025, if it remains on schedule, and who knows where it is right now in that timeline or project plan, if you will, to be this self-sufficient economic powerhouse, manufacturing powerhouse, to manufacture all the vital items and products that they need to be self-sufficient so that if a war ever breaks out, they won't suddenly not be able to have smartphones or communications devices or microprocessors and so on. And this is why they are doing what they're doing in their 2025 plan. Now, let's use one very real example. Now, if you take the issue of the military, if there were ever a military conflict between China and the United States, if it happened today or over the next few years, the Americans would obviously use the Joint Strike Fighter, or JSF, or F-35 aircraft against China. Now, this single aircraft and its variants is being used across all of the American military forces. It's a one-plane-fits-all concept, per se, and the USA has also given the same plane to Israel. They have made their own modifications, and it is being used by all the NATO allies. So in any war with China, F-35s can destroy Chinese military assets at will because they're far more advanced than what China has today. China needs a deterrent. So instead of inventing one on their own, China simply used computers to hack into and steal enough of the key engineering blueprints from the United States military. They stole them from a contractor, and they basically stole the blueprints to the Joint Strike Fighter. So guess what happened last year, folks? For the first time ever, China started flying their JSF knockoffs in real combat exercises. This year, as I'm speaking here, China is now starting to deploy into combat operations the so-called finished version of their version of the stolen Joint Strike Fighter. Now, this is not to say that China's copy and stealing of the American JSF makes it as good as the American original. It does not. But see, China doesn't have to be better. They just have to be good enough, okay, to pose a critical threat. And that's all they're aiming for. Anything else is a bonus. So, as part of China's plans to become a world leader in key technology areas so that it's no longer dependent on outsiders, it has been gobbling up strategic and vital minerals and elements in Africa, Afghanistan, Pakistan, wherever it deems it necessary. China needs to make its Made in China 2025 program work because its big prize is the defeat eventually of the USA in any military conflict, or at least being able to hold its own without going nuclear, as well as replacing America as the world's number one economic power. In other words, China has basically a two-pronged major course of attack here. One is to beat the U.S. economically, which it is on its way to doing, and it is helped when countries like the U.S. have a $500 billion deficit. That doesn't help America, it hurts it, costs Americans jobs. And then on the other side, they want to be able to at least hold their own or be able to have a standoff or at least make the price of a military conflict with China and the United States so high that maybe the United States won't bother defending Taiwan, or maybe it will become a secondary or second-rate power in Asia. That is what China wants to do. China wants to dominate Asia. So it has other sub-plans within that. And I know this, having lived in India for 7 years. China has a plan within its 2025 plan to subdue India, as well as contain India and keep India from ever becoming a credible threat. And how they intend to do that is very simple. India, of course, will pass China in the next decade or so in population. And after the commercial break, we'll talk about how that worries China.
From our broadcast studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, to the world and beyond, you're watching the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net.
AVS Media Den.
You have heard of the X-Zone? Now watch it on Simul TV, plus 500 video games, live TV channels, free video on demand, worldwide, and more. Does this sound like tomorrow's television? Well, it is, but you can have it today, right now. It is Simul TV. Simul TV offers what the others only wish they could provide. 15 exclusive channels like X-Zone, Sci-Fi, and Horror. We are worldwide. No other provider offers that. 500 built-in video games. No need to have an extra expensive system. We have them included. Free video on demand. Live streaming events from around the world. Interactive online network, and much more. Tomorrow's TV today. Simul TV. Sound too good to be true? Well, it's not. You can have Simul TV today. Sign up at simultv.com. Do it today.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365. Rob McConnell here, presenting an overview for Nicholas Paul Jennings, author of a fascinating book, Amen. It presents facts revealed by Egyptologists, facts that enable us to understand why Amen is the beginning of creation of God. It provides recommendations for religious leaders of the major religions to unify their beliefs and teach the Word of God. Love one another. Amen informs people how mankind conceived God. It was the Egyptians that developed the concepts of a soul, a hereafter, and Son of God, And finally, after the worship of many gods, they conceived the belief in one universal God, the maker of all there is. For more information, visit www.futureofgodamen.com. That's www.futureofgodamen.com.
Welcome back to Cal's Corner radio show here on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. My name is Kal Korff, and I'm your host. And the executive producer of the show is Rob McConnell. Now, we were talking about India before the commercial break. As I mentioned, within the next decade, India is going to pass China in total population. China is so worried about that because it ultimately boils down to babies. Let's be honest. I'll be blunt about it. If a country has a small population, they're limited. If they have a large population, they have a lot more capabilities, theoretically. So what's happening is China has now abandoned its one-child policy because they realize that India is going to pass them now, and that bothers China. So you might say, well, if India, the world's largest democracy, passes China, then they'll become number one, and that's okay because they're a friend of the U.S. and the free world, yada, yada, yada. They're a democracy. They don't intend to invade other countries, unlike China. Why are we worrying? Well, we're worrying because, to be very honest with you, I'm not the only one who feels this way. A lot of people who live in India know this is true. India, unfortunately, is frustrating because it's too often its own worst enemy. For example, India has, ever since Prime Minister Narendra Modi got into power a few years ago when he trounced Rahul Gandhi by winning more votes than any human has in an election on the planet, he started a program called Make in India. Wonderful idea. Make stuff in India. In fact, I've always wondered as an American why we don't outsource things to India, because at least India is not our enemy. They're not communist. They value human rights better than India, although it's got a long ways to go in India too, trust me. But at least they're not dangerous to the world. So why don't we just have the Indians make stuff if we're going to outsource stuff to Asia? Well, now India is trying to make that happen. And India has become, to Modi's credit, the country in the last few years which has received the most amount of foreign direct investment than any other nation. The U.S. used to be first. It's now second or third. China and India fluctuate between those two positions. You might say, well, that'll solve it. Well, no, it's not that simple. In fact, it's reached the point where you have to kind of leave India out of the equation, meaning you can't count on them anymore. And let me explain why. Apple is a perfect example of the problems in India. Now, I worked at Apple for years. I knew Steve Jobs. In fact, if I had not met him, I would never have gotten into the IT business. I know all about Apple dealerships, how they do their thing. I admire their business model. I agree with it. I use their products. But I'll tell you, living in India, trying to buy Apple products is a joke because there's no Apple dealers there, okay? None. Instead, there's third-party companies that try to pretend and look like they're Apple and say all the right buzzwords and design their store so it looks like a mini version of an Apple store. But when you start dealing with their products and the availability and all that other stuff and the pricing especially, it is a nightmare. In fact, if you want to buy a top iPhone, it's going to cost you about 50% more just because it's in India. Okay? No valid reason. Now, my Indian friends will tell me that's not true, Cal, because, Apple doesn't have a manufacturing plant in India, therefore they have to pay these extra taxes. Well, that's just an excuse because there are plenty of instances where India and other governments have given large companies who create jobs, exemptions where they don't need to make their stuff there, but they can still get the discounts. Well, India is deciding not to do that, and that's a shame on them. And let me tell you why. What India has told Apple, and I've reported on this, is that 30% of their components must be made in India in order for them to get all these great tax breaks. Well, Apple has told India the blunt truth. You guys can't make the stuff we use in our products. You don't know how. And we're not going to take the time to teach you. Why should we? It's already working in other countries. So they reached a compromise. There's now a couple of models made in India, the 5S and the 6S. I have a 6S Plus, actually. And they're made in India. All these parts are brought in. And the Indian government has said, okay, we'll delay your requirement to have 30% of your products made in India or parts made in India. We'll delay it for another 5 years. Folks, that is not how you solve something. That's how you kick the can down the road. When the Chinese government heard that India is going to delay this rather than change, they're delighted because they got 5 more years to do whatever at India's expense. So, having lived in India and seeing a huge amount of Chinese products in there, I know people who trade with China. I can tell you that India just doesn't have its act together collectively to go up against China. And it is India's fault that they're in the sad state of manufacturing that they are. India's never going to become an economic superpower if their main product is making textiles. It's not going to happen. Okay, there's plenty of other countries that make clothing. So you can't count on India to be a bulwark against China. Instead, you have to pressure India to do the right thing, and that's quite a common thing, unfortunately. And even then, they may do it, but kicking and screaming, and then the way they do it tends to not be as optimal as it could be, okay? So that's the blunt truth there. Now you have another sad reality, India's military. Could India's military really threaten China? No. In fact, China, in the time I've lived in India, over a 7-year period, I saw China go from being concerned about India's military growth to now not even bothering wasting any time on it because they don't have to. The way India's military is going today, it is so schizophrenic and dysfunctional. They're lucky that Pakistan doesn't have its act together better. Otherwise, Pakistan would be able to really take it to India independent of any backing from China, which is yet another issue. And I'll cite just one example because I've reported on this extensively. India got the bright idea years ago to make their own indigenous rifle for their soldiers. Great idea, right? 7 years later, folks, they still couldn't get a satisfactory prototype, even though it was a ripoff of existing weapons. Now, think this through for a moment, what I just said. Imagine you're the military of a country like India. You have the second largest population in the world. You have a huge army of over 1 million people. You've got another roughly 1 million in reserve. You want to make your own rifle for your own homeboys. That's great. And all you're going to do is just copy and, gobble together what already is working from other weapons. Maybe you might take this sight from this rifle, this barrel from this one, this caliber from this one, this trigger from this one, put it all together. You say, oh, it's Indian now. Now you can make your own stuff indigenous. You don't have to pay anybody to fund your own military by supplying weapons made by foreigners. But 7 years go by and they couldn't even come up with a satisfactory prototype. And it's not as if they were being asked to invent the rifle for the first time. They couldn't get it right. So you know what India finally concluded last year, grudgingly? We'll just buy the weapons from Israel. Well, hello. So now that's what they're doing. Israel has become the largest weapon supplier to India, along with the U.S. India is dumping its Russian-made weapons, long overdue. But it's going to take decades for India to catch up to where China is today. And by then, China will be even further along. And let's be honest, whenever you have a communist country with a hardcore ideology driven on hatred for the West, hatred for democracy, hatred for freedom, those hardcore indoctrinated assets are probably going to be a little more interested in taking the fight to you than passive people who worry about what cricket team is winning or losing, who get bored when they don't see something on TV that interests them. There's a certain pacifism in India that, as a Westerner, I don't understand it. I know that if the United States as a country had communist China and Russia and Pakistan on its borders, it would be a very different America. But when you go around India today, believe me, I've been there for years, you never know that there was this thing with China going on unless you drill down and start to talk to people specifically about it, because a lot of Indians just don't seem to care. I remember very vividly when India finally bothered copying what Israel did and made a cross-border raid into Pakistan and wiped out at least 50 terrorists and their military staging grounds, camps right there. They did a commando raid in the middle of the night, eliminated them, and came back. Pakistan denied the whole incident, of course, because they're Pakistan. And you should have seen the pride that was oozing out of every Indian I knew of. And because I am Jewish and I'm the only foreigner among many of my friends in India, especially at the newspaper there, they came up to me and said, we finally did the Israeli thing. We finally did the Jewish thing. We finally defended ourselves. We should have done this a long time ago. Well, no kidding. Okay. What happened after Pakistan got its nose bloodied? They haven't really done a major incident since. So as a journalist, I've always reported for years that India could have done more to beat Pakistan if it would only bother to retaliate, but they don't. China has taken advantage of this, encouraging Pakistan to mess with India because that's what China does. It uses proxies to further its interests. Now, we'll come back after the commercial break here in a moment to wrap this up. But before we go to the commercial break, I just want to emphasize this. The way the world is going now, it seems that there is this jockeying towards spheres of influence, okay? You have China wanting to control things in Asia. You have India saying, wait a minute, we've got a voice in this, although India doesn't seem to want to become a world superpower. In fact, they're the only country I've ever been to where they don't seem to want the job. Every other country wants to become a super powerful thing. And then you have, in Europe, you've got the European Union, then you've got Russia, then, of course, you've got the United States, and you have a president running the United States now who has said, make America great again and put America first. While you can't always put America first, you can at least try to level the playing field, and that is what Trump has been trying to do on some issues. And contrary to the doomsayers, the world hasn't ended yet. So we'll be back after this commercial break, and we'll wrap this up.
You have heard of the X Zone? Now watch it on Simul TV, plus 500 video games, live TV channels, free video on demand, worldwide, and more. Does this sound like tomorrow's television? Well, it is, but you can have it today, right now. It is Simul TV. Simul TV offers what the others only wish they could provide. 15 exclusive channels like X Zone, sci-fi, and horror. We are worldwide. No other provider offers that. 500 built-in video games. No need to have an extra expensive system. We have them included. Free video on demand. Live streaming events from around the world. Interactive online network, and much more. Tomorrow's TV today. Simul TV. Sound too good to be true? Well, it's not. You can have Simul TV today. Sign up at simultv.com. Do it today.
The new nonfiction book, Razor of Madness, is similar to cult movies like Clockwork Orange, Dragon's Tattoo, or The Other Side of Hell. Wayne Morin Jr. and Thomas Lee Howe will expose widespread and systematic deficiencies in this thought-provoking tell-all novel. Mind control rages among scholars in law schools. Human rights are ignored while thought reform and mental manipulation are accepted practices used as behavior modification. Dr. Louis Jolyon West comes to mind. Media and public scrutiny shows that United States mental hospitals are in fact destructive murder industries. Razor of Madness expose novel details this epidemic through an in-depth professional and personal investigation. For decades, there has been a revolving door policy that still releases killers and pedophiles back into society. The maestro of mind control continues to haunt America to this very day. Razor of Madness is available in paperback or as a downloadable ebook at Amazon.com.
The concept of a new age has been around since the late 19th century, yet much of its original meaning has been lost. What exactly is the new age? Is it a religion, a collection of obscure esoteric practices, a series of doomsday predictions, or an astrological event? The New Age Chronicles is a unique complementary publication bringing reason and grounded information to separate fact from fiction. chock full of valuable information to support you as we make the monumental shift into the new era. You won't want to miss a single innovative issue. The New Age Chronicles newspaper is coming soon to www.newagechronicles.com.
Welcome back to the fourth and final segment here on Cal's Corner Radio Show. My name is Kal Korff, and I'm your host, and the executive producer of the show is Rob McConnell. Now, to wrap this up, because again, you could spend hours on this going into fine detail. Again, the world seems to be shaping up into alliances of spheres of influence. You've got the EU in Europe, of course, and you've got Russia. Those are the two big guys there. You've got China trying to be the master of Asia and eventually the world. You've got the United States leading the so-called free world. You've got India and Asia trying to say, wait a minute, we've got a voice in this, but they just can't seem to win the gold medal for whatever reason. That's on them. And so what's going to happen now? Well, unfortunately, too much of the world, especially among the younger generation, from what I've seen, and this is my opinion, and I think I can defend it. When I talk to some of the younger kids today, they don't even know who John Kennedy was. They remember he was president, but that's all they can pretty much say. There's been some recent surveys done of so-called millennials. It turns out that about a third of them aren't sure the Earth is round. Can you believe that? A lot of them don't even know what the Cold War was. They weren't alive then. And while that's not their fault that they don't know what it was living through it, shame on our so-called educational system for failing to pass on the lessons of history. Because as the old adage goes, and it's true, when you fail to heed the lessons of history, you're going to repeat the tragedies of it. And this is what I think is going on now. We have to remember that historically the Chinese have always thought a long ways down the road. They don't run their country or existence one quarter at a time like the West does. So they think years ahead of time, and they plot and they scheme and they plan. And when I say and use those terms, don't mean it in a conspiratorial sense. I mean it in a logical sense. If you're going to have a long-term plan, you've got to plan, you've got to scheme, you've got to execute. It doesn't matter what the subject was. Recently, there was a Chinese worker for Apple who was arrested at the airport in San Jose because he tried to go ahead and steal the blueprints or some engineering data. He had downloaded some data to a disk, and he worked on Apple's new secret autonomous car project, which they haven't released that automobile yet or whatever it is they're going to do. Still a couple of years away. But Apple has made no secret that they've been trying to do an Apple car or at least help with the technology of autonomous driving. They actually have at least 50 vehicles driving around in California testing these right now. So what this engineer did, according to the press reports, is he was a Chinese individual. He downloaded data on this drive, booked a flight to China. He was arrested at the airport and busted with this, and now he's going to do some time. It was just the latest instance of industrial espionage by China. And this is where what I call decision time comes into play. This is where the USA and the rest of the self-proclaimed civilized world will now and in the near future have to make a key critical series of decisions. And the decision concerns the question of what kind of world do you want to live in? What kind of world do you want to leave for your children? You know, we all know this, but that doesn't mean everybody does it. But we all know that it is the responsibility of all generations currently alive to work hard and do their best to ensure that their kids have and live a better life than their parents did, than we did. Each day, all of us must work to push the human race forwards, not backwards. Help democracy, the democratic process around the world. Help with freedom. Continue to spread the concepts of freedom around the world. Do acts that back up supporting freedom around the world. We have to do this for the survival of the human race. Okay. And we know this from our history, and it's happened before. The human race has come together in some of the darkest and uncertain of times to ultimately triumph and defeat a problem, to conquer a foe that needed to be vanquished, like Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany. And a more recent example that is probably on the scale that this issue is with China has to do with how the Cold War ended. And that's the irony of this example, because not only is it the major last one from recent history, but unfortunately, there's too many young people today who don't even know what I'm talking about and will learn about it for the first time if they hear this or if they bother searching on the internet. Go back to the time in the late 1980s and early 1990s, very early 1990s, 1991, when the Cold War ended in Europe. Okay? Russia at that time was the world's other superpower besides America during those decades. Each country, the United States and Russia, Soviet Union, had tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, all pointed at each other, that could destroy the entire planet several times over. Yet as the dominoes of communism fell literally each month across Central and Eastern Europe, where today these same nations are now free and genuine democracies, members of not only the European Union, but also NATO, humanity made a decision at that time in all that chaos to opt for freedom and not tyranny. Now, in 1991, after the dominoes of communism had fallen in Europe, it finally happened in Europe, or in Russia. I was in the former East Germany at the time when the USSR ceased to exist and Russia eventually became the Russian Federation. I was there. I saw it. I was with some Russian troops for the first time. They were very friendly because they could be. In fact, the Russians at that time, and I'll never forget this, it was quite interesting, they were so concerned about the Germans rising up and trying to lynch them that they decided to sell their uniforms and everything they had that would tell anybody that they were a Russian soldier. Instead, they could say they were Polish or something like that. So I ended up buying a couple of souvenirs from some of these Russian soldiers. And they were very nice guys. They were happy that Russia had ceased being communist. They were partying, they were celebrating, they were hoping for democracy. But the reality was that while Russia would not end up being a truly free democratic country, that's not what it is today, there was a much bigger problem at that time, other than what kind of country is Russia now going to be. And that problem can be summed up in two words: nuclear weapons. What would happen to the nuclear weapons now that were not only stationed all over the former Soviet Union or Eastern Europe under the repression of communism, but what would happen to Russia's arsenal itself? Well, it turns out that the U.S., working with top Russians, paid billions of dollars and tens of thousands of scientists, the exact number is still classified, who used to work in the Russian military-industrial complex, who made weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons. What they did is they paid these guys to go ahead and basically not bring their skills to rogue nations. So what the humanity was able to do was not only capture and rein in these nuclear weapons and actually reduce them over time, they were able to keep them from falling into the hands of terrorists and even mafia type figures who would have used them for blackmail purposes if not another design. So if the human race can do that under what was an almost impossible task to be successful to achieve, one would have thought going into this that maybe one or two nukes would get out, a city would disappear, there would be an act of terrorism, whatever. But that did not happen. It did not happen because enough people cared to step in and do the right things to prevent it from happening. And that is the same situation that is occurring today. If you look at what Communist China stands for today, it stands for totalitarianism. No democracy, no real freedom. In fact, while the communists like to call themselves communists in China, what they really are is totalitarian capitalists. They love money. But in order to make that money their way, you're denied the basic of rights. Nobody is going around the world today trying to copy China. Nobody is going around today trying to copy Russia or Iran. Instead, they're all trying to copy the United States and the West and how the West does its thing. So the world has a decision to make. Do you want to continue to feed the beast? Do you want to go ahead and continue to empower China to eventually become the world's only superpower, or do you want it to become so powerful that it can then dictate what you're doing? China is now trying to make its inroads into Europe and the European Union. It is receiving some pushback and resistance from it because the Europeans are starting to wake up and see that China has all these conditions attached, that the reason they're really doing this is not because they really want to help, but they really want to make themselves instead much more powerful. So this is the decision that the world has to make. If the United States loses this war with China right now over trade, if it loses it today, there will not be a good future going forward. If the United States, as the world's top economic power, cannot rein in China economically through sanctions, then no other country can. Do you think Germany is going to be able to do it? Germany's trade with China is a joke at this point compared to the United States, and the United States, ironically, is China's biggest customer. So if we don't stop China now and try to pressure them to reform in ways that they must for the good of humanity, that means, stopping this dictatorship. Their new dictator's been reappointed for life. Where's the outrage by the left-wing liberals over this? Instead, they're just focusing on Trump or mad that Hillary lost. Their focus is missing the bigger picture that one day is going to come back to bite them if they continue doing this. Thanks for joining me. We'll be back next week with another episode of Kal's Corner.
Modern Esoteric, Beyond Our Senses by Brad Olson, consummates the lifology story about where humanity originates. It is the lost continents, the primitive wisdom, the mythos of creation, and the rethinking of ancient history as we are taught in academia. There is much more to the story than what we have been told. As this is the first book in the Esoteric series, Modern Esoteric starts at the beginning of time and accelerates up to this modern age. Future Esoteric is book 2 in the series and takes a forward-looking position ahead of today with an open and honest examination of the ET issue and various unexplained phenomena. To discover the writings of author Brad Olson, visit www.bradolson.com. That's www.bradolson.com. Are you or is someone you know struggling with addictions, depression, anxiety, relationships, low self-esteem, lack of confidence, grief, success, and prosperity? Do you know that your subconscious belief plays a big role in the outcome of your hard work? We can help you permanently change the beliefs that may be the reason for your struggles and failures. We care about getting you the return on your investment and the results you are looking for. We can help you be free of the limitations of your past and in realizing your highest potential. We work with people by phone and Skype. For more information, visit us at www.ritasoman.com. That's www.ritasoman.com. Do you think you have energy problems in your home? Do you feel better when you're away than when you're home? Joey Korn is a global leader in the world of dowsing who specializes in personal energy clearing and space clearing. He can help you create an ideal energy environment in your home no matter where you live in the world. Learn about his remote spiritual house cleaning services and much more at www.dowsers.com. You can get Joey's book, Dowsing, A Path to Enlightenment, as well as other dowsing books and tools, Kabbalah books, and Walter Russell books. Joey's work is really amazing. Go to dowsers.com right now. That's DOWSERS.com, or call 1-877-DOWSING. That's 1-877-369-7464.